Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to be a part of this festival. It's just been wonderful. And I'm from Madison, Wisconsin, and you're all welcome to come visit us, but it's not quite as nice there right now. But I'm so excited to share with you this incredible journey that I was on writing this book called Educated. No, I'm just kidding. I'm joking. I like to tell jokes. I hope you guys don't mind. It's late in the day, so hopefully I can get you laughing a little bit. But I want to tell you about this book that I wrote, When Death Becomes Life, and talk a little bit about why I wrote it and about what it's all about. I thought it was worth starting talking about why I wrote this book and how I was able to do it. Because I am a transplant surgeon, which does take a fair amount of time, and I have a couple of kids, and my wife's a surgeon, and we are pretty busy. But I will tell you, I grew up in a family of books and always loved reading. I have two brothers, and my parents would make us read 2 books a week, particularly in the summers, and then they would read the books as well, and then at the dinner table we would talk about them. And I suppose that could make you hate reading, but it made us all really love it, and we still to this day keep kind of a virtual book club going. So I always loved it. I watched my brother's career. My brother Ben is a writer. He's written 20 books. Some of those books some of you may know. He wrote the book behind The Social Network and behind the movie 21. And I was able to watch his career and meet a bunch of his friends, so that maybe instilled even more into me that I wanted to write a book at some point. As the years went by, I started thinking more and more about what I would want to write about. I've certainly read a lot of wonderful books in healthcare, in medicine that I really enjoyed. But I was reading the book Emperor of All Maladies in 2011, and I'll never forget that I was actually on a boat in Miami, and I was up all night reading this incredible book. And what Mukherjee did in that book, which ended up winning the Pulitzer Prize, is he used his patients to tell the story of the history of cancer, or particularly pediatric blood cancers. And I thought it was really beautiful. It was such a really amazing human way to talk about science and innovation and how healthcare, how we solved at least some problems and went from one point to another. And I thought, right after I read that, I thought, I want to do something like this. Now, I wanted to do it a little bit differently. I think my field is a little bit different, and I definitely wanted to tell the history of transplant. And you have to remember, transplant is a really new field. Really, in the 1940s and 50s, the concept of transplant was truly science fiction. In the 60s, 70s, there were a few crazy fools that were involved in transplant, but for the most part, it was terrible. The outcomes were awful. The people in the field were treated like they were crazy. And then around 1983, with the approval of cyclosporin, which is one of the basic immunosuppressive medicines, the field suddenly started to work and became this reliable field. And that's not very long ago, and it was really over a short period of time. To me, that was like putting a man on the moon. It was really this incredible innovation that I wanted to celebrate. The other thing I knew is that a lot of the pioneers were still alive at this point. Some of them still are, some of them have been dying off. And I wanted this opportunity to go talk to them, and not to find out what they did, because I knew what they had done and there have been some histories written, but really to understand how were they able to do it? How were they able to persist when all their patients were dying, sometimes in their hands, when every day they would go on rounds and people had these terrible infections, their organs weren't working, and people around them were calling them crazy, were telling them they should get out of the hospital. I just wanted to know, how did they keep going? And I guess to me that was very important because I am a surgeon, and maybe the thing I struggle with the most is when patients have complications or when they die, which thankfully is not that often, but it does happen. And I know some people will say, well, these people were sick, they were going to die anyways. I don't buy that at all as a surgeon. I know it's true that if you're doing a liver transplant before, in that period, they were going to die anyways. Or if you were considering a kidney transplant before there was dialysis, they certainly were going to die. But that said, there's something very different when someone dies in your hands. And it just never could become this thing that you can cope with just by saying, well, they were sick anyways. And yet these guys persisted. So I wanted to understand that. So that was one part of the goal of my story. The second part was to tell my own coming of age as a surgeon. And I wanted to write a really honest book about what it's like both to train and then become a surgeon, what it's like to make decisions all the time, to be right many times but be wrong sometimes. Sometimes your mistakes lead to someone dying or you even killing someone. And how do you deal with that? I've always been very, very honest with people, honest about what I've done, about my own shortcomings. I'm honest with my patients, and I think that's helped me develop a great rapport with my patients. And I wanted to write a book that really showed that. And so that was a second part. And then I wanted to tell the story of my patients. And I think of my patients as being the recipients, but also the donors, the living and the deceased donors. And I wanted to celebrate those donors because to me, the donors are people that run into a burning building to save someone. That's how I see it. It's incredibly heroic. For a living donor, it's probably safer statistically than that. But it's still a leap into the unknown. And I wanted to celebrate this. I think a lot about my field, and I think about what's special about it, besides the innovation, besides the interesting people that go into the field, is the fact that we have these donors. And I think other areas of medicine, you're trying to prevent death, fight off death, maybe give someone a good death, which are all important. But transplant, it starts with death. We actually take from death. And I think allowing donors to give this gift, this legacy, is one of the most important things we do, and we can't lose sight of that. We can't look at the donors just thinking about how long our recipient list is. We have to really think about allowing them to donate is actually our job, and it's probably the most important thing we do. So, okay, I had this idea, I'm going to write this book. I thought it'd be fun to talk about how I did it, because there are all these like amazing, huge authors that you guys have been hearing from, and I'm slightly smaller than some of them, so I have a process also, though. It's not quite the same as James Patterson's. He probably already would have finished a book in the part I was saying already. But, one thing I will say, if any of you guys are thinking about writing a book, a really good strategy is to get a brother who's a best-selling writer. That was really a good thing for me to do. So I went to Ben and said, Ben, I want to write this book, and, I've been thinking about it. And Ben gave me a great encouragement, but he also helped me get an agent, and that was huge. I ended up linking up with a guy, Eric Lupfer, who manages a lot of nonfiction. And I had a phone call with Eric, and I'm sure he had no interest in doing my book, but he seemed, when I talked to him about the idea, to think maybe it could work. And he said, yeah, the way these things work is you don't just write the book, you should start with a proposal. And I said, that's great, Eric, I have a proposal already. And he's like, great, send it to me. So I sent him my proposal. My proposal was 12 pages long, and it was titled The Legend of Big Daddy. So it turns out I make our fellows, our trainees, call me Big Daddy, and I think it's obvious why. It's kind of weird, I admit. We can talk about that later. But Eric called me back and he just said, no, we're not doing this. This is not happening. I'm like, okay. So we actually then spent a whole year going back and forth working on the proposal. And he was invaluable to me in telling me, okay, now we're going to work on this first chapter. In this chapter, I want you to write who the characters are going to be. Or in this chapter, I want you to actually write the introduction. Or in this chapter, I just give me an outline of what it's going to look like. And after a year of going back and forth, we had the proposal. And I don't think my clock is, I better keep an eye on I could speak forever, just so you guys know, and it's the end of the day, so I'll have to keep an eye on Yeah, give me a 5-minute shut up. Okay. That's what you say to me. I didn't say that to you. I find that, cursing out the audience is a good strategy in a talk. So then we ended up shopping it around to some different editors. And I ended up going with Gail Winston at HarperCollins. And the reason I went with Gail is that all the other editors, you'd go meet with them, and each place that I went to had a different vibe. They'd have this cool music playing, and you'd meet with a publicist, and they'd be telling you how great you were, which I really enjoyed. But I wasn't sure that was what I needed. When I met with Gail, who's a very senior editor and a brilliant person, it was just her and the publisher, and she said, listen, we can do all that other stuff, but I really was interested in your treatment and how you seem to use humor even in scenarios where, you're talking about death. I find that really interesting. She was wondering how I was going to make the chronology work, because I basically had these three stories: the history, my coming of age, my patience. And she was like, I think this can be really great, but it's going to be really challenging. And I was really impressed with how she thought about it. I was a little bit intimidated, but I respected her immediately. It reminded me exactly of my relationship with my wife, who's a surgeon, who's amazing, and yet I'm a little afraid of her as well. So I went with Gail, and so we signed, and it was time to write the book, and I was like, Gail, what do I do? And she's like, well, write the book. I'm like, the whole book? And she's like, well, you can do whatever you want, but a lot of authors will just write the book, and then they'll send it to me. And I was like, can I write a few chapters? And she said, yeah, that's fine, whatever you want. So I wrote 3 chapters. The first chapter was hilarious. Like, it is the funniest thing. If I had a little more, well, I have time because they're not running the clock, but, oh no, they just started running it. That's too bad. If I see any of you guys out, like in a bar with a drink, I can tell you the other chapters. They're hilarious. But so Gail gets back to me, and she's like, Josh, we're going to cut the first 2 chapters completely. You got to trust me on this. The audience has to get to know you. You have to develop a rapport with them. And it was crushing, right, because they were such great words. But then Gail said, why don't you go ahead and just write the book and send it to me? And I'm like, okay. So my brother Ben gave me a few pieces of advice, 3 pieces of advice, 2 of which were great. And I'm going to give them to you because maybe that'll help you as well. The first thing he said is, when you write your first draft, just write. Don't worry if it's any good. Don't worry if it's digressing a little bit. It doesn't really matter. He said the number one reason people don't finish their first book is they get obsessed with making it perfect, and they never get past the first chapter. That's what he said. That's a little different than what Michael Chabon said in his talk, but I mean, he has a bit of a different skill set maybe than I do at this point, but where he said he really focuses on each sentence. But that's what Ben said. He said, just write. You can clean that up later. That was advice number 1. Advice number 2, he said, was at the end of the day when you finish writing, never finish at the end of a story or the end of a chapter. Because he said the hardest thing is when you get up in the morning and the kids are around, or you get on the internet, you can't get started, you can't get going. And he's like, if you stop in the middle of a story or even in the middle of a sentence, you'll start writing, you'll finish that up, your juices get flowing, and you'll just start cranking along. And that was amazing for me. The third piece, which I didn't use, was that he writes a certain amount of pages per day. Of course, he's a full-time writer, and I mean, I have this other job, so I basically was going to write every second I had time. So I started writing, and I was obsessed. I could not wait to get out of bed at 4 in the morning and write. I would write in between cases. I would write at night. I would write all day on the weekends. I just loved every second of it. It was amazing. Like, it was kind of crazy. I was sitting on this laptop just cackling away, and my wife was like, what are you doing? I'm like, like thinking I'm writing the next great American novel, which it turned out I was. But anyway, so a year goes by, and I'm like, I think I'm done. And then I'm like, I think this is long. So I said, Ben, how long is a book? Because you can't tell, right? It's on a word processor. I can make it any length I want, right? And he's like, well, we do books based on words, and an average book is 60 to 120,000 words. And he's like, how long is your book? And I'm like, I can't tell you. And he's like, no, just tell me. It was 300,000 words. Which is actually longer than the Bible, I think. And it probably won't do as well as the Bible. Maybe it will. But, I should tell you guys, I was a Russian language and literature major in college. And I feel like Tolstoy would have been very proud of me for my work. But I did this one stupid thing, because I didn't know, was this any good? I don't know. So I actually decided to send it to Gail. And there was a writer who wrote a piece in The Atlantic on how to write a book. I think his name was Ricketts. Maybe I'm thinking of the disease I have because I live in Wisconsin. I don't get any vitamin D. And he wrote that the first draft is for the writer, the second draft is for the editor, and the third draft is for the public. I feel really badly that my editor had to get my first draft, but nevertheless, I sent it to her. And then I didn't hear from her for like a month, and I'm like, oh my gosh, she's going to cancel the whole deal. That's what I really thought. And then finally she reached out to me and she said, Josh, your book's long, She's like, listen, I edited the first 100,000 words, and I want you to use this, apply to the rest of the book. So then I spent the next year editing, and I will tell you, I loved every second of that. It was so fun to me. It was certainly painful to cut things, but it was just this process. I loved every second of it, except the copy edit, which I hated, but I don't want to talk about that. I am working on a comedy show called The Cutting Room Floor because I think I had some hilarious stories that I had to cut, but I won't tell you those jokes right now. So then at the end of a 3-year process, I had this book, and I just am so proud of it, and I miss writing it, and I can't wait to do another one. So if any of you guys have a good topic, let me know. I know some of the writers have said they hate when people do that, but I wouldn't mind it. All right, now let me talk a little bit about the book. And I like to read a little bit of it because the words are so good. I just feel like reading a little just to get you in the mood. My brother makes fun of me. He's like, nobody reads anymore. I'm like, well, it's my first one. I should be able to read. So I always knew I would start and end the book on an airplane. So I'm in this field of transplant, and a lot of people don't realize that we fly out and get the organs. And sometimes that's great, and sometimes it's not. We do fly in bad weather, and I will tell you, pilots will fly in anything if they don't have to follow rules. So they probably love it. It's probably like taking on a complicated operation. You get all fired up. You're like, I can solve this. You plan for it. I think they like it as well. In one particularly bad flight that I was on, after we landed, and I think there was a bit of screaming coming from the back of the plane. The pilot turned to me and he said, I really prefer to fly freight. And I said, why? And he said, because freight doesn't scream. And I was like, okay, that's not awesome. But I'm always nervous when I see them looking over at the cooler, and I try to say, it's not a rush. I mean, it seems like it's a rush, but we can take our time here. Okay, so here's how the book starts. Chapter 1, A Perfect Organ in a Small Plane Over the Hills of La Crosse, Wisconsin, September 2 a.m. While I'd been on planes many times, I'd never experienced the full power of a thunderstorm at 10,000 feet. The small King Air, a 6-passenger dual prop, was bouncing around uncontrollably. Every few seconds, it would go into free fall and then hurl itself back up violently. The 2 pilots in the cockpit were hitting knobs and dials, trying to silence the various alarms that sounded as we rocked violently back and forth. It didn't help that our physician's assistant, Mike, who had been on hundreds of flights in small planes before, was screaming uncontrollably, "We're gonna die! We're gonna die!" That's actually cleaned up from what he was actually saying. Given that Mike was such a seasoned member of our team, I could only assume that this particular flight was going badly. Then I skipped down a little bit. I hadn't chosen transplant surgery so I could fly through thunderstorms in the middle of the night over the fields of central Wisconsin. Hell, I'd grown up in New Jersey, spent most of my life in the Northeast, and had never known anything about the Midwest. I had been drawn to Madison because it is one of the best places to be a transplant fellow. That is really true, and that's the whole reason I ended up there. So, I started on this plane. We're flying out to a procurement, and that really was my first procurement. I remember we got up there, and of course, things had settled down by that point, and we drive into the hospital. I think we were up in Green Bay, actually. And then Mike said, let's go speak to the donor family. And I was horrified. I thought, I don't want to talk to them. They're probably going to look at me as this vulture who is coming and taking the parts of their loved one. That they're going to have this memory of my admittedly beautiful face, as the person that's coming to take away their loved one. That couldn't have been further from the truth. I remember we went into the room, and there were about 15 people there of different age groups. A lot of them were crying. But the room lit up when we came in. They wanted to understand everything about the process. What were we going to do? Would we transplant the organs that night? Who were they going to go to? Would they be going to Packers fans, of course, because it was Green Bay? We couldn't admit that there might have been a Bears fan in the mix. Would they start working right away? Then they wanted to tell us about their loved one, to tell us what the person liked to do, where they liked to go, what was important to them. And then, when it was time for us to go do the procurement, they didn't want us to leave, and we all hugged them, and they thanked us so much. When we go into the operating room and do a procurement, our group, and I think many do this, we always have a moment of silence where we kind of think about what we're about to do. And then our procurement coordinator will read something. It's usually a story that the donor family gives us about the person who died. Again, something they like to do, who was important to them, something that was meaningful to them. Sometimes it's a prayer or a poem or something like that. And we all stand there and think about this gift. We usually think about our own families. Then we have to turn to the operation. And it's really an interesting mix of emotions when you go from thinking about who this person was, and then you have to do an operation. I look at all surgery as kind of a puzzle. When you're doing an operation, I don't think that much about who is the person I'm operating on, how old are they, who loves them. I really think about the task at hand. How do I solve that puzzle? Sometimes the puzzles are easy, just a few pieces. Sometimes they seem like they're thousands of pieces. And you just have to focus on the steps. How do I do the steps? Can I keep the case moving forward? Do I need help? Is something not going the way that I think it should be going? I usually try to get a 3D picture in my mind of what the structures are going to look like, what the operation is going to look like. In many surgeries, you have good preoperative imaging, so you can really study these films, the CT scans or the MRIs, and you can build in your brain this model of how everything's going to look, where the blood vessel is going to be. And you actually can get so good at it that when you go in, you just know what it's going to look like. And then at any point when something doesn't look like how you pictured, you're either in the wrong spot, which is possible, or you didn't picture it right. So that's a time when you can step back, look at the films again, maybe call for help. I think a lot about this essay that Malcolm Gladwell wrote some years back in the New Yorker called about physical genius, and he wrote it about Wayne Gretzky and Yo-Yo Ma, and this famous neurosurgeon who was in San Francisco. And he talks in that essay a lot about practicing for so many hours. I'm sure a lot of you guys have actually seen this essay. Getting so good at tasks that you just can replay them in your mind. And he writes about this neurosurgeon and how he would be at the scrub sink and he could, visualize the case exactly. And I think that's so true, almost to the point that sometimes I'll be lying in my bed afterwards, and it's almost like those NCI shows where the cameras can zoom in on things that you didn't even notice. Like, you can almost do that about an operation where you're looking at things you didn't even realize you see, and you're like, oh, I wish I had done that differently, or oh my gosh, I didn't do that. I had this one case that I write about in here that I think is so fascinating, where we did the operation. I had done a liver transplant. The patient had some complications, had a really bad bleed, and I took him back to the operating room to fix a bleeder in the duodenum. And then I was going to change how his bile duct drains. It was a pretty complicated operation, and I don't do the duodenal part very often. So I actually had a friend come in, always got to be humble in surgery, and had a friend come in and help me with the duodenal part. And we opened that up, got the bleeder, closed that. And then I moved on to the next part of the operation, which I've done many times before, and I don't really even need to think about it. But then, all of a sudden, some bleeder occurred somewhere else, and I had to stop what I was doing, go back to that. We fixed that problem, and then I went back to the operation that I was doing. I was sitting in my office the next day and just kind of running through the steps of the case. And all of a sudden, I'm like, oh my gosh, I didn't put a tie on the other end of the bile duct, because when I had jumped to this other bleeder, I had missed that step. And I was like, oh no. And I called my fellow, but he was on a plane on another procurement, and I left a message on his phone. When he landed, he was like, no, you're right, we didn't put a tie there. So I actually had to run down to this guy's room, and he was there with his wife, and I remember his wife watching over him, and she was so nervous about him, but they were kind of beaming at me, and he was like, he had just had the breathing tube out, and he was like, oh, thank you so much, I'm going to make it, aren't I? And I said, I got to tell you, I missed one part of the operation. I need to bring you back to the operating room. And I remember his wife's gaze of, daggers. And what he said to me, I just will never forget the line. He said, so am I a victim of medical error? That's what he said. I'm like, maybe. So I ended up taking him back to the operating room, and it was exactly I had pictured it. I put the tie on. He ended up doing great. He's actually a high school teacher, and we ended up developing an amazing rapport because I was so honest with him about the whole thing. We're human beings, and we try to get it right. We try so hard to get it right, but we stay humble. We stay with our patients. The hardest part of being a surgeon is not the operation. It's dealing with the complications. It's dealing with the agonizing, the constant thinking about how a patient's doing. Did I do it all right? Did I not do it all right? It's very, very challenging. I was reading that book by Abraham Verghese, Cutting for Stone, which I think is a beautiful book. And he's not a surgeon. He's an internist, a medical doctor. But he writes about surgeons, and there's this one scene where this character, Ghosh, who was a medical doctor, starts operating on patients. He was taught by Stone, and he just started doing it, learning on the job. And then Stone leaves the hospital, and Ghosh has this scene. He does this small operation, and he starts talking about it, and it almost feels like how I used to talk about surgery. He's like, "Wait, did I hook that bowel to the right spot? I should have looked again. Did I leave any sponges in there? Did I stop all the bleeders? Didn't Stone say to do that?" And then he says, "Now I understand what Stone always says. When the patients open, you own them. When the patients close, they own you." That is brilliant. I mean, how Verghese knew that. I mean, I'm not putting down him not being a surgeon, but that just gets at the core of being a surgeon. And I think that should have been me writing that. But anyways, so that's a little bit about what it's like to be a surgeon. Let me say a few words about how I ended up as a surgeon, because I mentioned a little bit of this in my talk yesterday. But the truth is, no one would have expected me to have become a surgeon when we were growing up. I was kind of a messy kid. I couldn't draw a straight line with a T-square. I never made model airplanes. I didn't really work with my hands. But I was smart. I liked to solve puzzles. I liked to think about problems. I always had this feeling that I could learn things if I tried hard. I was never afraid about trying to see if I could do something. I was obsessed with the show MASH. I loved MASH. My parents had a rule that on top of reading 2 books, we weren't allowed to watch TV during the week, but they let us watch MASH. And I loved Hawkeye Pierce. I loved how he used humor, as his coping mechanism. I wanted to be a meatball surgeon, and I still tell people that's what I am, even though I don't really know what that is. Somehow he reminds me of my father, who went back to medical school and did his training when I was in 3rd grade, and my dad's still alive, of course. But there's something about Hawkeye that reminds me of my dad, and so I actually think that did play some role in it. When I kind of stumbled into medical school in many ways. I was a Russian language and literature major. I had traveled in Russia, but I didn't ever think that was really going to be part of my career. I had done the sciences I needed to do in medical school, or in college, I should say. But my first day on surgery, I came in at 4:30 in the morning. I was pretty nervous. We rounded. I rounded again. Then I found out I was on call, which I think is great training for the rest of my life. Is never make plans. You're probably on call. And then I was in the OR all day, scrubbed on cases. I didn't eat or drink all day because I was so nervous. And I remember at about 10 at night, I was scrubbed on this bowel obstruction, and I started to feel really sick, and I was sweating. Kind of the irony of when you feel like that is you also always feel like you're going to have a bowel movement, which was really unpleasant. So I was hanging on the bowel, it was gurgling, and the surgeon was like, stop pulling on that. But somehow the feeling passed. I got through that operation. I'm sure you guys don't like to hear this if you're undergoing surgery. There are other things in the book you may not like to hear either. But anyway, so that operation got finished, and my resident said, hey, it was now after midnight, and he said, go next door and scrub on the case there. And I was like, all I want to do is go home, but I'm a trooper, as I said, fine. I stumbled into the next room, and it was the middle of the night, there was classical music playing, and it was a kidney transplant from a deceased donor. And the surgeon was Dr. Stubenbord. I'll never forget that. I scrubbed in, and he's a very calm man. He had this beautiful music playing, and the operation was just going really smoothly. And when he released the clamps on the kidney, and it turned pink, and with the music playing and me standing there really doing nothing, and urine started squirting out on my hands, and I was like, that is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I can't believe that works. That shouldn't work. And at that moment, I wondered, what other organs could we do this with? What was the story with the donor? How did they die? I really wondered, like, is this something I could do? I was really interested to know that. Like, I probably shouldn't be good at this, but can I master this? Can I do this? And I really was hooked from that moment. I know it sounds cliched, but it's totally true. So I want to move on. We've talked a little bit about deceased donors, and I could talk all day about deceased donors who are, such heroes to me. But I also want to talk a little bit about living donors. We do living donation for kidneys and with livers. We definitely do many more kidneys in this country than liver, although we do some. It's a pretty big operation. In some other countries, Asia, Turkey, Korea, China, they do a lot of living donors with liver because they don't have a lot of deceased donors for various reasons, some religious, some not. In this country, we have a lot of deceased donor livers. So I want to talk a little about living donor kidneys. There's something very special about being involved in a living donor operation. It is maybe my favorite thing to be a part of. These people, to me, are amazing. They sign up to take some risk to save someone. And I just think it's amazing. I think, it's something I would love to do, but I wonder, how could I fit it into my life? How do you make that work? I've got little kids, but they all do too, and they sign up to do this, and it's really this beautiful thing. I want to read this quote because, again, it's really good. So this is why I love the field of transplant. Since I began taking care of sick people, I have noticed that one of the hardest things about getting sick, really sick, is that you are separated from the people you love. Even when families are dedicated to the patient, illness separates the well from the sick. The sick suffer alone, they undergo procedures and surgeries alone, and in the end, they die alone. Transplant is different. Transplant is all about having someone else join you in your illness. It may be in the form of an organ from a recently deceased donor, a selfless gift given by someone who has never met you, or a kidney or liver from a relative, friend, or acquaintance. In every case, someone is saying, in effect, let me join you in your recovery, your suffering, your fear of the unknown, your desire to become healthy, to get your life back. Let me bear some of your risk with you. I think that's incredibly beautiful because I wrote it. No, I think it's really true. There's a piece about the risk that's actually an important part of this gift. Now, the risk is actually really low for a living donor. I mean, if you look at the numbers, most of the people in this room would be like, that's nothing. I mean, let's take the scenario of a living donor kidney. You want to donate a kidney to someone. We do the surgery laparoscopically, so we make tiny incisions with the camera. We make a small bikini cut. I say bikini cut because I wear bikinis a lot, but that's what it's called. Some people call it a fan and steel. It's what they do C-sections through, but that, you pull a baby out, this is just a kidney, so we can make it just about that big. I even sometimes do this whole surgery through the belly button, and I can completely hide the incision in that. So the surgery is, through these tiny incisions. Patients stay in the hospital 1, 2, maybe 3 days. They usually return to work in a month. The risk of dying is 3 in 10,000. So that's a really small number. It's not 0 in 10,000, but it's 3 in 10,000. The risk of developing kidney failure over the rest of your life, assuming we evaluate you correctly, which we do in this country, or to the best of our ability, I should say, is something like just under 1% over your lifetime if you donate a kidney. That is higher than if you didn't donate, but it's still a really small number. I do shy away nowadays, even though I just told you guys the numbers, from actually telling these numbers to my patients who are considering it. Because I don't think the numbers mean to the patient what they mean to us, right? If I told you, I'm going to do this surgery and you have a 2% chance of dying on the operating room table, most of you maybe would say, that's great, that's not bad, that's not going to be me. Whereas as a surgeon, I'm like, this is horrible. There are almost no operations we do other than a trauma where you're almost dead, where your mortality is that high. For liver transplant, we quote a 1% chance of mortality on the table, but these patients are really, really sick when we take them to the operating room. A lot of times I'll be talking to a patient and I'll say, listen, I think it's a safe surgery, but you could die during it. And they'll say, doc, I could go outside and get in an accident and die also. And I say, you know what? this is the accident. You've had the accident. So let's just see like how your recovery is going to be. Like I just think that it's still great because people want to do this and they get that there's some risk. But it's just very hard to convey to people what that means. Maybe that's okay, but I've kind of gotten the habit of staying away from the numbers. I want to read this other section. I'm not going to say my normal line, but I think this story. How good it is, that's what I was going to say. I think this story really captures something that I really like. Here's an example of why the numbers don't always affect a donor's decision. A potential donor came to see me wanting to donate a kidney to his wife, the love of his life, the mother of his children. He had been turned down by a major program due to medical reasons. He didn't have any absolute contraindications. He was not diabetic, didn't have heart disease, didn't have any cancers, but he was obese, his blood pressure was high, and he had a history of smoking. Each one of those things could have increased his risk of having a problem with his remaining kidney someday. When I first saw this man, I had my doubts too. But he told me, I know you guys think I'm a little more high risk than your average donor. I get that. But you've got to help me. This is something I really want to do. My wife is my whole life. Our family doesn't work without her. She has done so much for me. If you let me do this, I will thank you forever. I'll sign any form you want. I promise I won't sue you. He had me right there. If down the road something happens to my other kidney and I go on dialysis, it will be worth it for me. I have no hesitation. What do you say to that? This man seemed to have grasped the data, understood the risks. Wasn't it his body? How paternalistic was I supposed to be? Of course, it was possible for someone to make a bad, even an unreasonable decision for himself to protect someone he loved. Was there a risk that was so high that we would have to say no? We wouldn't let mothers and fathers donate their hearts to their children, even though many patients would be willing to do this. In the end, I let the guy donate, but not before giving him my standard line, which I'll give to all of you guys also, by the way. It's not necessarily database, but I'm pretty sure it's true. If you donate and stop smoking, you may actually be healthier than if you don't donate and keep smoking. Of course, the worst scenario was the most likely one, that he'd donate and keep smoking. Anyways, we did the operation. It was challenging because of his size, but everything went well because I'm really good. And he had a little hard recovery, but nothing that I would consider major, and he got back to his life. So back in my clinic about a month after the surgery, I asked him how he felt about the whole process. Doc, this is the best thing I have ever done in my life. Sure, I had a few bad days, but I have my wife back. I will never be able to thank you enough for what you did for my family. He gave me a big, warm handshake. His thick, ruddy hand enveloped mine. It was the hand of someone who had done physical labor all his life, a hand that would provide for his family no matter how much it took from him. He got one thing wrong. I'm not the one who did something for his family. I love that image, and something about the hands of a worker. As an aside, a couple of years ago, we took my wife and I took our kids to a dude ranch because, they were sick of the boring vacations we would go on and they wanted to do something more fun. It turns out I wasn't really created to be on a dude ranch, and it was kind of embarrassing. Like we would have to put our saddles away, and they gave me like a high up spot because I'm Big Daddy. But I could barely lift the saddle and get it up there, and I have a bad back. So I was like paying all the wranglers to put my saddle away. And at one point, one of the wranglers, after I paid him a little money, he went to shake my hand, and his hands are like sandpaper. They're these thick, the hands of someone who's just working with his hands. And he went to shake my hand, and he was like, "Your hands, they're so soft." And he like called over all the other wranglers, guys and girls, and they were all just like, "Oh my gosh, they're so beautiful." So I love this image of the hand. It's okay, though. It's okay. I do want to tell one story. It's a little bit funny, but I think it's kind of beautiful, too. A lot of people are interested in this idea that some of the recipients seem to feel like they take on some characteristics of their donor. And some people call that cellular memory. As a scientist, I don't really believe in that. I don't think your liver or your heart can be transferred to someone and they suddenly have your memories. But at the same time, the non-scientist in me, the human in me, loves those stories. And there are some of those stories that you can't really explain. We transplanted a girl named Michaela, this beautiful young blonde girl from the town of Spring Green that I write in the book. It's 98% white and 100% Packers fans, which is true. And she ended up receiving the liver from an African-American young man from Rockford who had lived a very different life and died in a gang-related event. When she woke up from surgery, she had been so ill, but she woke up and the first thing she said was, "I want a hamburger," which was really weird because she didn't really eat meat. Her family thought that was really weird, but she kept saying, "I want a hamburger." And when we finally gave her the hamburger, she said it was the best thing she's ever eaten. She was dying to meet the family of her donor, but they didn't want to write back because they were suffering. And we encourage people to write letters, but we always tell them, some people may not write back, but I think it's really wonderful that we do that. There are some countries that don't allow the donors and recipients to interact. For me, it's been incredibly positive. But finally, on the day that, finally what happened was our organ procurement organization stayed in contact with the mother of the donor, who's this wonderful woman, and finally she said, "I'm ready, I'm going to write a letter." So they called Michaela's mom and said, the letter's going to come, just be ready. And her mom's very close with Michaela. So when Michaela got the letter, she's in her car and her mom's with her and her mom filmed it, so we've all been able to see it. And Michaela was shaking and crying, and she opens, and she's just this beautiful, honest person, and she opens the envelope and she just shrieks out, "He likes hamburgers!" And it's just this really incredible thing. When she got home, she Googled the name of the donor, as we all probably would, right? And immediately found these police reports, sees this African-American face staring at her, gang stuff. And she initially was really scared. She thought, "They're going to come for my liver." She actually thought that, which is really interesting. But she very quickly realized that I'm not going to judge this person. This person saved my life. And she has become part of that donor family, and she uses it as a teaching moment. The name of that chapter is "We're All the Same on the Inside." But she goes around now and gives talks about this, and she considers them all part of her family. A funny aside to this, this one time I was doing a liver transplant, and the donor had been in Green Bay. And when I went into the pre-op room to meet the recipient, he's there with his whole family, and he had a Bears blanket, and they all were wearing Bears gear. Because in that part of the country, everyone wears, sports, usually football gear. And it was just every single person had Bears stuff on. And I was just thinking it's kind of ironic because, right, the donor's from Green Bay. So I did the surgery, and it went really well because, again, I'm really good at it. No, that's not true. I'm actually a very humble person. But you can't just say that, right? It has to be real. But it is true. But anyways, the surgery went well. And then I came into the room the next day, and the breathing tube was out. He was looking really good. He had his blanket on again. And I came in, and they were all, so thankful. And I said, "Guys, there's been one complication." And they're like, "What?" And I said, "He's a Packers fan now." And, to show you the true beauty and penetration of the power of this gift of transplant, he said, as long as they're not playing the Bears, I'll root for the Packers. And his wife ended up making him a pair of sweats where one leg was Bears, one was Packers. And and I thought that was really remarkable. I could go on forever, but they won't let me. But I want to end with how the book ends. I hate reading the ending because then you know how it turns out, but I did make it through. I said I was going to begin and end it on a plane, so let me read you this part. As the plane levels out at 20,000 feet, I look over at Felix, our German-trained procurement surgeon, stretched out comfortably in his seat, headphones on, fast asleep. Wide awake myself, I look out at the night sky now lit up by the moon. For a second, I wonder what I'm doing here, flying in this little plane over the farmlands of Oshkosh, separated from my family. My two little girls, now sleeping peacefully at home, will wake up in the morning and discover me gone, an experience they're quite familiar with. I shift my gaze back to Felix, along his extended legs, and down to the cooler he is so unceremoniously using as a footrest. Inside sit a liver, 2 kidneys, and a pancreas. Somewhere else in the same night sky under the same moon, 2 other planes are flying in different directions from ours. Each one has a cooler. One contains a heart, the other 2 lungs. Just 2 days ago, these organs were working in concert. allowing a 42-year-old father to eat, drink, go to work, hold his kids. These organs helped him climb up on his roof to clean out the gutters, but they couldn't stop him from falling off. Now they sit in ice until they will be filled with blood and return to the living, ready to sustain a new body, allowing 5 other people to live, love, be happy, be sad, enjoy their families. These 5 people don't know one another, don't even live in the same city, but they will forever be joined by the web of transplantation. They will be saved by some guy who will never get to see his gift of life, but maybe down the road his wife and children will, and maybe they'll think, yes, he was some guy. I know that's what I think. I lean back and close my eyes, but I can't sleep. That's how it ends. Thank you guys so much.